we are live.
Hey,
How are you doing, Angela?
I'm doing very well. Mike, how are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty good, thanks. I'm excited for this discussion. Yeah, I'm caught up. I'll say that. I'm not behind like I was last time.
Fantastic.
No. So definitely ready for the discussion. And I
I am
hope
ready for the discussion. And the discussion that we're referring to is the DevOps Handbook, famous tome about DevOps. You've probably heard it mentioned somewhere. You've heard it mentioned somewhere, especially if you're in the DevOps realm. You've probably heard of the Phoenix Project and all those types of things. And this is just a testament to the fact that this methodology works and it is always being improved and iterated upon. And this is a interesting read. It says the DevOps Handbook: How to Create World-Class Agility, Reliability, and Security in Technology Organizations. And I will tell anyone who will listen, we are all technologists. Every company is a technology company. And if you are pushing any sort of code any which way, um, having a methodology in which to do it and iterate quickly and easily and efficiently is probably the best way to do it. So DevOps is the way, I think, right?
completely agree. And yeah, you saw me holding up my Kindle last time that we were here. I had the physical copy of the book, which I still have around here somewhere, but I switched to the Kindle version, second edition, because the first edition didn't have case studies in it. So
Exactly.
I actually am behind then because I blazed through and skipped over the case studies in the second edition so I can be caught up with everything else. But I'm going to go
Okay.
back and read the case studies because I like case studies. I like to see examples of how things were applied and everything was revealed based on their examples or whatever the case is.
And there
And
were
I
quite a
think
few. There were quite a few.
yes, yeah. And I think we'll get into that because I've got some examples to share, some case
Yes.
studies of my own based on the topic for part one, or the the concepts that were shared in part one. Before we get into that discussion, I'm going to give a shout out to Mohammed Yusuf that is joining us again
Hello,
live
Mohammed. Thank you
from
for joining us,
LinkedIn.
my friend.
Thank you for joining us. If I understand correctly, it is late wherever he is located in the world, or early, like early AM, depending on how you want to look at that. So thank you, sir, for taking the time to join us today.
We do appreciate it.
Yeah. So with that, and I did want to share an image for those of us that are watching this in video form.
Mhm.
I'm sharing a graphic of the three ways of DevOps, and we can talk about these in turn. But I had to bring a graphic to this discussion because I forget these ways. I really wish, if I had one critique, if if the authors of this book had a better way to describe these ways other than just the three ways. I think that's kind of maybe it doesn't lend any credence or remembrance, if that's even a word, uh,
I
to
see what
these
you mean.
ways.
I see what
Because
you
I'm
mean.
like, if you can look at how somebody's doing it, you're like, oh, you're doing it the second way. Well, which way is that, friend? It just kind of I draw a blank on it. So I wanted to bring this graphic to the discussion.
So let's
Um,
talk about it. Let's talk about the three ways. So the
yeah.
first way is flow,
Yes.
and it's going from left to right, one direction, and it's the delivery of work from development to ops. That's the way it goes.
Yes.
And then there's the second way, where there's feedback, which is a
Mhm.
gift. So it goes in this one direction, but you need that cycle of feedback to understand where to improve, where mistakes were made, where those teachable moments are. So when you move through the flow again, you are making less mistakes. You have learned from said mistakes and you're doing things more optimally. The the next path go round. And then I love the little curly cues in the middle, because
Mhm.
this is my favorite part. This is continual learning and experimentation, which means you're constantly cycling through, learning from your mistakes, iterating, making things better, experimenting on new things, how to improve processes. It's a moving target. There's always room for improvement. There is no perfect system. They don't exist. Um,
Right.
so there's the flow, because we're always going through the flow, and then we're getting that feedback and we're bringing that back through the flow. But then we're constantly learning, we're constantly improving, and we're constantly experimenting to improve our processes. So we're gonna keep saying that over and over and over,
Mhm.
and we're gonna make it canon. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make
Okay.
3 ways canon. So for ourselves, and definitely for the people who are listening as well. So that was the first part. It literally talked about the 3 ways. What do you want to add to that?
Um, each one of these three ways I have experienced intensely. That's what I will contribute, and I'm prepared to testify to every single one in
Preach.
in this brief but very intense book club discussion. Okay, the first way, to me, I've seen that where to me it still feels like throwing stuff over the wall. Like the developers say, "Hey, we got this code or this feature for our applications. You, sir, madam, the ops person, here is the thing. Have fun with it." And then they
Yeah,
bounce. And it's like, come on, man. What are you doing? The thing broke. I'm on call for the app, and you're giving me bad code that I just pushed. It breaks. I have no clue what this thing does, or maybe I do, whatever the case is. I've been in situations where I didn't, and I still had to figure it out and fix it.
exactly.
But I'm like, man, this okay. We have this, if you want to call it, process, and I'm doing air fingers for the people who are listening to the audio version. Um, but it's not very fair. It's not very equal. Like I am kind of left out here alone with this uh, feature, whatever it is, this application that the
Right.
developers have given me to serve whatever purpose, the value stream, because they talk about value streams or whatever.
Hmm.
And now I feel like I'm breaking the value stream because I'm deployed broken code. And I'll wrap with this, is like making work visible, I think, was a point in this thing. And
Hmm.
I did get a lot of throw it over the wall, a lot of shoulder taps in an environment where I did not have a ticketing system or any sort of like work tracking system. I may have had my own system, but the developers couldn't see that. They didn't know what I was working on, and so they would be giving me stuff random times to deploy, et cetera, and not much documentation along the way with that. So I didn't have a method to, number one, show them what I was working on and how whatever they were doing could fit into that, and number two, I didn't have a way to feed back to them, like in a process oriented way, that, hey, your stuff broke, friend.
Mm.
We need a better way to fix it. So that's kind of my experience with the first way.
Okay. Well, I think that's kind of probably where most of us, depending on your age and when you started doing this before DevOps was even a thing. Uh, Here's my code, make it run on this system. That was just the way it was, and um, there was, sometime there weren't test environments where you could test, and it works on my machine, yeah, because your machine is a Windows workstation, and now we're talking about a Linux server. Like there's
Mhm.
always those things that were these barriers to the environment, where I think those barriers have lessened a lot, where we're dealing with containers now, and it's less of, as long as you have the code and it's running on a container engine, it'll usually work how it's supposed to work, no matter where you're running it, usually.
Mhm.
But not everything is containerized, right?
Yep.
Things still run in virtual machines and things like that, things of that nature. But um, the process remains the same. The flow of getting code from dev and pushing it into the operation, so customers can get the benefit from it. And there was a part in the book where they were talking about defining lead time versus processing time. And
Hmm.
I remember when it did we there weren't a lot of upgrades, like updates to a software. I remember Banner,
Mm.
and there would be a couple of times a year where you could update Banner. This is working in higher education,
Mm.
because the students are there and you needed to be up, and you can only do it during summer break or winter break, or you know what I mean. So that was kind of
Yeah.
the cyclical way of doing things back then. But now things are much more modular. You can upgrade this part, that part. You don't have to worry about the whole system being impacted. These monolithic applications are really, they haven't gone away, but a lot of vendors have kind of moved away from it. Which is great, which means we can iterate faster. We can make improvements faster.
Hmm.
When the new hotness comes, especially with open source, like, you think about it, with open source, tech changes and improvements are happening all the time. People are always contributing back, making things better and improving upon it. Why wouldn't you want the new hotness inside of your application if it is available and tested and secure, right? So instead of waiting a whole year until it gets baked back into some said version, just update what's there. Like,
Yeah.
get the new hotness and test it and make sure it works, and bring that feature and that functionality to your customers even faster. So that we're shortening those lead times and those processing times,
Yeah. And looks like
but
you've
not
got
enough.
yeah,
Preach,
somebody to
Eric.
commiserate with that banner installs.
Yeah, he's my higher ed buddy. He feels me on
Okay.
that. So it
Yeah.
has advanced, but he's 100% correct. It hasn't gone away totally. But we're it's there everyone's we're hoping everybody improves, right? This is why we're talking about DevOps to this day. I mean, this phrase was coined, in the early aughts, right? And it's
Hmm.
2025, and we're still talking about, how best to implement, because everybody does it differently. um there is no one way of doing anything, but as long as folks get started. I think maybe it was in chapter 3 when they were talking about the Nordstrom move to DevOps, and they took the most problematic program or project, which was like their e-commerce and
Hmm.
their mobile something. I can't remember, but you got to start somewhere. And sometimes, somewhere is the low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the green field, was like, this is this new idea we have. This seems like the best way to get into DevOps. But I also read a stat in here that most DevOps transformation happened with brownfield, about 60%, where they're taking their legacy stuff and they're improving upon it, using DevOps, which I think is amazing. So yeah, there was a lot. What are some of the takeaways that you read about? Because
Yeah. So
I have
that's
pages of notes.
yeah, that's a perfect segue into my testimony for the second way.
Hello.
Because if I think of the quote unquote DevOps implementations that I've had to put into place, many of them were brownfield. Like, hey, this thing is broken. This is the most terrible, raggedy, error prone deployment process that we've ever seen. Can you, Mr. Jenkins, can you please make it more proficient? And honestly, I'm usually the person who's asking that question because the developers that I support, again, like if we're like coming from that first way into the second way, they don't know what that deployment process is like. They just give me the code. They just tell me it's ready, but I'm like, no, we got to do this in a more automated, repeatable, less error prone fashion. Um, so definitely offering feedback to the developers to say, hey, we are, I mean, and this is just almost bananas to me. Like, no, we're going to have a development environment or a test environment where we actually test out these new pieces of code, the way the application runs before we present this code to the production instance. Let's start there. Okay. I'm going to put your code here first. I want you to test it out. Let me know if it works the way that you think it should work. If it doesn't, we're going to fix it before we go to production.
Mm.
Let's do it. Let's start there. So then we can begin that discussion of feedback. And it's, I mean, I'm not a gatekeeper by any means to production, but hey, I'm gonna probably gonna wait until your code is working here in the development environment, which is still very distinctly different from the production environment, but it gives me some sense of, I don't know, credence or confidence that
Yeah.
when I bring your code to the production environment, it's going to work, you know. And I mean, this is years ago. If anybody that I work with right now happens to be listening to this, this is nothing recent. Okay, this is many years ago, where, you know, everybody just kind of get their DevOps chops around them. But yeah, so that's kind of my second way testimony. Is like sometimes you just gotta, in a very pleasant way, put your foot down to say, hey, let's talk about this thing. You're going to give me something, I'm going to give you some feedback on that, and I might even give you developers something, and as the ops person, you're going to give me feedback, and I'm going to
Mm.
have to
Exactly.
operate on that. You know, I'm going to have to,
Feedback
honor
goes
your
both ways.
requests. Exactly. It's a two-way street. So yeah, definitely appreciate the concept of the feedback in the second way.
For sure. So in chapter two, because I have notes here, there was a lot of things about um, the work stream, and we and I just came out of safe agile training last week, and there was actually, you have the to do, and you have the work in progress, and you have all these if you're talking kanban, where you're moving work in this visual representation of from idea to completion. What is done? What is the idea of done? And done means
Mhm.
different things for different organizations, right? You and this is me going on a quick aside for the second chapter, the second the second of the ways, where
Mhm.
you want to limit how much you're doing in each uh,
Yes.
piece, right?
Yeah.
Limit the work in progress, right? And if you've ever noticed on my Twitter profile, I'll say multitasking is a myth,
Mhm.
where we really, as humans, we don't do our best work when we're constantly task switching. So it's always good to, focus on, one feature, one thing, just this one thing, and make it, solid, as opposed to trying to do a lot of little different things. To just limit the batch sizes, keep the amount of code changes really small, because that's where you can see your errors. You think about, the more code you're changing, the more troubleshooting you might have to do. Um, Another thing about DevOps is reducing handoffs. You think about back in the day, where you had to get an IP from this person, and you
Oh
had
my
to have
God.
security scan over here, and you had to have get something from this person over there. And now, with so much self-service nowadays, where you can obtain all of these things that you used to have to actually open a ticket and go to someone for, self-service has made this that is almost obsolete to a certain extent. um, that's another way where we're shortening that flow. We're getting it out faster, but we're hoping that we get some feedback in. We're always trying to improve we're always trying to improve every flow that goes through. So that second wave is talking about the feedback. And then also the last thing is, you know, we don't want to waste our time, right? So they were
Mhm.
talking about all these ways that we can waste time. And I just mentioned some, like when you're waiting for a handoff, or
Yeah.
when you're trying to tie in extra features. Nah, keep it simple, stupid. We want to keep it very small, very succinct, because when you're trying to troubleshoot a whole lot of code, a lot of issues, that tends to slow you down, right? And the last thing is partially done work. And this was, again, you have to read the book so you'll understand, where someone said, oh, they go to the stand up and say, yeah, I'm working on that. I'm almost done. I should be done tomorrow. And then they'll come to the stand up and yet, yep, I'm still working on it. I should be
Mhm.
done tomorrow. I'm almost done. Whereas there's a time when everything should just stop, They call it
Hmm.
the there's a term for it. I don't know if they call
Yeah.
it all hands on deck or whatever.
Yeah, basically somebody pulls the cord on the assembly line
Pulls the
and
cord.
stops
Like,
the
wait a
assembly
minute,
line.
we're gonna you've said this 3 days in a row. It'll be all hands on deck. We're going to make sure that
Yeah.
this your thing that you're working on, we're going to get through this. And it's a team approach as opposed to putting the onus on one person. It could be a bandwidth issue, it could be a knowledge issue, it
Mhm.
could be anything. But when everybody stops and says, "Okay, this is a problem. Let's all hands on deck help this person figure out what the problem is," with no blame, with no shame, with none of that. But that's how you get past it. Like, everybody has knowledge in their head that they can share to help this person who's coming to the stand up, who could be dealing with a myriad of issues. Let's help this person out. And then once it's done and dusted, everybody wins. The ball keeps moving. So um that's there's so many gems. Again, this is you weren't if you're joining us, you weren't in our little our green room where I was talking about, yeah, I really didn't want to read this book, but, and here's my caveat, but I should read this book. I think we this is a
Yeah.
book that it shows us the principle and the why. Like, it's nice to know
Yeah.
the why. It's all we're always being inundated with things, but hearing the why and understanding the science behind it, it makes it a little bit more palatable for me. So that's me on my second. That's me on my second way talking about the feedback loop and
Hmm.
the myriad of things that tend to slow down our work stream. Let's talk about number three.
Number three, experimentation. So again, yeah, definitely have to testify and relate to this one. Um, uh, and I mean, number one, we talked about the squiggly feedbacks where you're getting a lot of feedbacks because you're experimenting as you go throughout this feedback cycle, between dev and ops. In my experience, once you do have a process in place, sometimes people don't want to experiment. So, what I've had to do, and what I share with you, dear listener, if you're joining us live or listening to the playback, you have permission to experiment, because a lot of times the team, be they the developers, the management, the customers, they just want it done, whatever the it thing is. They want their code deployed, they want the application to be up for some percentage of nines or whatever the case is. Whatever it takes to get there, they don't really care sometimes. So if you're doing a manual deployment and getting it done, and you know that you can automate that deployment, start experimenting with that. That's what I've had to do in the past, where I had, again, going back to my first way team, not anything recent, but very manual deployments, right? So I'm looking at the technology that's available. Like, we've got Ansible, which is a great tool for I was doing Linux system administration, and great tool for managing Linux systems. We've got Jenkins. We've got I mean, I could go on and on. I don't want to name all these tools because we don't want to necessarily get into the technology of the thing.
Right,
For
right.
me, it's all about the process, right? So what I was able to do in this experimentation phase, where we finally got some feedback going, on my own, I experimented with deploying applications, updating servers using automated technology instead of doing it manually. So on my own, I'm doing this, right? And so they come to me, they being the developers, or whoever needs these features deployed, to say, "Hey, we're ready for our next deployment." I'm like, "Bet, let's do it." Deployment happens, and they're like, "Hey, let us know when it's done." In the past, that might have been a couple hours for this deployment to happen. Through my experimentation, I was able to get it down to probably like 15 minutes.
Hello.
Right away, I'm not going to tell them like, "Hey, yeah, it's done." It's like, no, let them cook for a minute, let them marinate.
In the words of Glorilla, let her
Yeah,
cook.
yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So, but that freed up time for me to be able to continue to experiment, to
Mm,
take care of other features, or other things that I needed to manage. So they still got their deployment on time when they needed it. It was just faster from my perspective, because I allowed myself to experiment. And in my notes here, I said experiment without permission. So if you're considering a process or something that needs a touch, build a dev environment is so much easier to do now than it was for me back in the
It's
day, where I
true.
actually had to like rack a server and wire it, and like you were talking about request IPs and all the domains and all this other kind of stuff. You could build a dev environment on a cloud in minutes these days, and or container systems on your local, or containers on your local system. Build a dev environment, test out this thought, this, whatever the automation is, whatever the technology is, experiment with it, and then bring that back to your team and say, hey, I found this way, it's kind of cool, we should check this out. And you'll have your experimentation in this third way, this amplified feedback was on the feedback side, but in this continuous experimentation phase of the third way.
You said something really interesting. You said you don't let them know right away, right? You've given yourself this cushion, this window. Um, and that's a level of safety that you've given yourself. Like, you don't want to put so much out there.
Yeah.
And there was a part about enabling organizational learning in a safe culture, right? We want to
Mm-hmm.
be able to
Yes.
experiment in an environment that champions experimentation, that doesn't call, me coming up with a great way to do something as, are you just making more work for us, or you're stepping on toes, or things of that nature. There's a they call it pathological organizations, where uh, they deal with in fear and threat. Like, you don't want to step on toes. Well, I don't want to. I'm sure there are
Mm-hmm.
organizations out there that are still like that. I've seen a few bureaucratic organizations where this is my fiefdom, this is my rules, this is how I do things. And some people don't necessarily want to raise their hand and maybe do something to improve, because the fear of lack of psychological safety. And culture is a huge part of DevOps. Like, DevOps ain't a tool, it is literally your culture supporting this new way of improvement and innovation. And without being able to experiment and try new things, and having doing it with your whole chest, not having to worry about getting in trouble, or someone thinks you're stepping on their toes. This is literally the culture that, folks are trying to cultivate. The third part is huge, it being safe
Mm-hmm.
in that third part, so you can improve, so you can have that continuous learning, so you can continue to experiment and improve processes. um, the safety of the workers doing the work is and the culture is really important there. So yeah, that's us talking about the three ways in
Yeah,
DevOps. We
no
did it.
doubt. We got through it. Thank you all for joining us live
Yeah,
for this brief but intense
very.
discussion. I know, and I'm here for it. Appreciate the comments of everybody that joined us. Ekaterina
Thank you.
Brown, Muhammad Youssef, Derek Arnold. Thanks for joining us live on LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you're joining us. If you missed us here, you can subscribe to the YouTube feed as well.
Yeah.
Um, I think I will put that link in the comments or show notes or however you do it
Smart.
on this thing. And you could catch us there. We'll be back next week to talk about part 2, principles of flow. So this is where the after we're introduced to these three ways, we get some deep dives into each of these ways, right? So be prepared next week with part 2 to discuss the principles of flow.
And if you
You got anything else you want to add, Angela?
No, if you can grab a copy of this book and join us for this little read along, we would definitely appreciate it. You might be able to find it in your library. You might be able to find a PDF somewhere. I'm sure it's out there on Audible.
Mm-hmm.
We would love for you to join us next week and contribute to the conversation. We want to hear what you think as well.
Hey, let me get that out of the way so we can say bye to the people. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Until next time.
We'll see you.